Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Eugene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Eugene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is an action-based leader with multi-dimensional expertise, empowering people to bring their best energy every day. With more than 15 years global experience in designing systems, tools, products, and services, she currently serves as Product Management Director, Modern Workplace Transformations Frontline Worker at Microsoft. Please welcome Tulsi Keshkamat. Tulsi, really excited for you to join us today. Thanks for coming along.
Likewise, Gene. This is a favorite topic, so excited to be here as well.
That's awesome. And I'm really excited to share your thoughts with the audience today. So, one of the things, if you've listened to our podcast before, we like to kind of ask our guests this kind of, big question, which is, what's the biggest challenge you see facing the deskless workforce today?
That's a great question. And I love that you start with this one. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening currently in the world. I mean, no surprise, everyone understands the pandemic has been difficult for all of us. One of the things that this pandemic has brought front and center is that digital transformation, as we think about it for an organization, is critical to information workers, or what we call the people who have desks. But it is also critical to frontline workers, or what you described as the set of people who are deskless. They're typically mobile first, but the pandemic really did a good job of showing us how critical they are. The world cannot run without them. That just became immediately obvious. But also it became important for us to realize that they need to be part of this conversation of digital transformation. If we don't include them, we are going to be left behind and we can't adjust to the changes that are happening. So that's the first thing. From there, now, I've seen customers do this. I've seen organizations do this, where they when the pandemic hit, they suddenly found that they didn't have great ways to communicate to their frontline. So now they had to adjust to that, and they had to adjust to the speed and scale at which they have to do it. But then that brings us to the major thing that I think about every day, the big challenge that I'm dealing with, which is, okay, so now we have technology that we help to address some of these challenges, but do we help in the way that they need to be helped? Are we giving them technology with empathy, understanding their problems, giving them the tools that they need to solve their problems? Or are we making it the primary focus of what they have to do? Are we using technology to empower them? Or are we, I've heard you describe this, are we doing technology to them, right? So one of the major challenges here is making sure that we are providing that technology to them in a way that it disappears. Their goal, what they're trying to accomplish, is the more important thing, not the tool that they're using to solve it. That just needs to merge into the workflow that they are trying to perform. So to me, that is a major challenge, and I'm trying to solve that every day.
So I think that's great, Tulsi, and I love how you kind of use those two terms, empathy and empowerment, and I'd love to kind of come back and talk to that. I mean, the other thing that I think you talked about so succinctly was kind of this definition of frontline, right? And it's funny because you kind of talked about how the pandemic has just, I think, raised awareness for the value of frontline workers. I mean, it's certainly a term that we've used at Skillful. Pre-pandemic, we were using it. I know that Microsoft was using that term pre-pandemic, but it just seemed all of a sudden, if you had used that term 3 years ago, right? People would like, well, what's a frontline worker? How do you define that? And I think it's just now everybody's talking about frontline workers all the time. You probably do a Google search for news frontline workers, there's articles all over the place. So it's really interesting. So, talk maybe a little bit more about how Microsoft kind of defines that, how you define kind of the frontline worker.
Yeah, sounds good. So frontline workers to me and to Microsoft are those key employees that are part of every major industry and are keeping the daily operations of that industry going. So typically they are mobile first. So you use the term deskless, we use the term mobile first, but pretty much the same thing.
Yep.
They are in a scheduled job that requires a lot of task management. And they are the ones who are interfacing with your customers. They are the ones interfacing with the product line, the ground operations. So to give a few examples, if we were to think about the customer service agents or the store employees in a retail store who are helping with customers. In manufacturing, you can think about the workers who are working on the line. In healthcare, you can think about the doctors and nurses who are literally taking care of us. All of these are frontline workers. And one important tidbit that I want to share, Gene, is very often we used to talk about information workers as being the critical component of any industry. They are obviously, you and I are probably information or knowledge workers, but frontline workers far exceed the number of information workers in any industry. Yep. So in many cases, hospitality, airline, healthcare, retail, manufacturing, these ratios are 6:1, 8:1, 10:1, right? So there's that many more frontline workers. And therefore now with the pandemic, because that criticality has come forward, as you pointed out, it has come front and center. That word frontline has come front and center because that sudden realization is there that we have not been thinking about them until now.
And it's really interesting. You talked about, this difference, you at Microsoft term kind of mobile first. We've been using the term deskless just because, even in the pandemic said, oh, everybody's a mobile worker, right? And I think that's true, right? Because most workers today, even if they're, mostly work at their desk, right? They have mobile tools and technologies at their disposal. But I think you're talking, it's not really about the technology, about the state of being, right? They're typically mobile or they're not at their desk, right? And I think that's the important distinction. The other thing that you talked about, which I think may be becoming a misnomer now, which is, information versus knowledge workers, right? Because increasingly, like, frontline workers are information workers, right? Frontline workers are knowledge workers, right? We're trying to push more information and give more information to them, as you talked about, to empower them to make decisions, right? And I think that's really kind of a critical thing, which is we need to start thinking about our deskless workers as another knowledge worker, information worker population.
I so love that you're making that point, because it is critical to understand that the access to information, the ability to connect and collaborate, all of that is very, very relevant to the frontline, right? You have to give them you have to empower them, allow them to make the decisions. And oftentimes their decisions have to be a lot more real time than in the case of someone who's sitting at a desk. I also really like how you double down on the fact that information workers and frontline workers are different, and we have to think about them differently. It isn't about giving someone a phone. Like me being able to check my email on a phone is very different from the tasks that a frontline worker has to perform and the tools that they are using in order to perform those tasks. So really keeping that difference in mind and being thoughtful about, are we giving them the right technology to do that set of tasks? Yeah. That is super important.
Yeah, I think it's a very great point, right? Which is, you have to understand their work. You have to understand their jobs, right? Before we can understand what technology, would be helpful to them, as you kind of mentioned early on, right?
Absolutely.
So, we talked about a little bit, we're dipping into kind of Microsoft and their vision of it. And I think everybody that's probably listening here knows who Microsoft is. But I'd love to talk a little bit more about your role specifically in your team, modern workplace and frontline worker. So just, I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. Like, what do you do? What does your team do? What are you responsible for?
Great. So my team, I specifically focus on frontline worker. When I say frontline worker, it's about the experiences that the frontline worker is having. These are the tools that we are providing them. So these might be different tools that they need in order to connect and collaborate with each other. These are things like walkie-talkie, for instance. There are Teams apps that we have created, a number of them, which allows them to do everything from their schedule management, what shift do I sign up for, to task management. Once I show up for my shift, once I clock in, what is the set of things that I'm expected to do today? That clarity is very important for, especially in that frontline worker space. And my team helps provide that. We think about the entire workflow of all the tasks that they need to achieve, whether they may need to get approvals for things, they may need to escalate some things, they may need to do targeted communication with each other, or their manager may need to reach out to a specific set of people. So those are all the features that my team has built. But we also think holistically about all the various personas in an organization. So on the one hand, we have these app experiences that are built for the front line. On the other hand, we also build experiences which enable others like the IT admins to go roll these things out to the front end, right? It's super important that we make that easy. IT admins have very specific things that they're thinking about. They need to think about security, reliability, everything that they're choosing has to be enterprise grade. But at the same time, they also want to roll out solutions that allow them to become champions for the front line, right? So how do we make it easy for them to do that? That's another thing that my team works on. So really how we do this is we talk to a lot of customers, we shadow a lot of customers, we are observing how frontline workers are doing their jobs. So we have simple insights that come out of it. For instance, we find that every day when they come in, they are looking at a notice board where that's the time that the organization knows they can grab their attention. So there are brochures, there are directions, there are health guidelines there. Simply observing that kind of thing gives us ideas on, okay, when they are clocking in, that's when we have their attention, we can get information out to them. That's the type of thing that we do. We observe, we interview, we take all of these things together, and we try our best to give them the products that will empower them to do their jobs in the context that they are in.
Now it's interesting when you talk about the products, and obviously you're in a product management role in that group. I mean, everybody is probably well aware of, the big products that Microsoft provides, right? So take something like Teams, right? And I think you alluded to the fact that, okay, but, Teams, but Teams with a twist, right? Teams kind of oriented toward what the frontline needs. And I think you alluded to maybe like a time tracking component of that. The shifts app. So is that working with partners? Is it kind of we're taking the Teams and now kind of, making a subset of that product? Just talk a little bit about how kind of you're attacking that from saying, okay, we have some great technology and great foundations at Microsoft, but now we have to put it through a different lens, if you will.
Yeah. So again, you keep hitting some great points. When we think about Teams and how we are thinking about Teams as a platform and how we are then building the blocks that can be used to provide solutions, we are really thinking in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah. So you're probably familiar with that. Yep. So we want to start with the basic things. So frontline workers, they are mobile first. We're thinking about the devices that they need to use, the device management that the organization needs to do so that they can access those devices in a safe way and perform the tasks that they need. As we go up, the next layers that we're thinking about are now Teams is running on these devices. Teams gives them some basic functionality that allows them to connect with each other, to collaborate with each other. For instance, calling, chatting, all of these are already like baked in basic experiences inside of Teams. Now, when we start becoming even more specific for a frontline worker, I talked a little bit about they often have to do task management. They often have to do schedule management. How do we provide them with the solutions that are catered to that? Communication is a critical component. That communication could be between, if you and I are frontline workers, we might need to use a walkie-talkie type application to just be able to connect to each other. I might need your help, or I might need, hey, where is this? I can't find this in the warehouse, right? Those kind of conversations. Or it might be corporate has to communicate with the frontline worker, for example, to say, here are some new COVID health guidelines that we're rolling out. We need you to do blah, blah, blah every day, right? So we really need to think about that entire gamut of everything that needs to happen, need to think about things that are happening across these various industries, and really like synthesize that into what is the set of solutions that we can provide on top of this amazing extensible platform. So there's a lot of things that organizations can do also in terms of customization, really pick and choose how they want that experience to work, or really use our recommendations on, hey, we think given all the work that we've done in this space, we think this is the direct experience that you need to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, you know, again, if you're a desk-bound worker or knowledge worker and you think of Microsoft Teams, you probably think of what you and I are doing right now, which is some sort of video conferencing and communicating. But for the frontline worker, they're not using video conferencing, at least in the way we think of it, right? Where they've got scheduled meetings and they're popping up and saying, oh, I need Teams for this. I think you highlighted, no, there's a different set of functionality or a different set of things that they need, right, to do during the day. And I think it highlights that distinction you talked about earlier between the information worker and the frontline worker.
That's exactly right. What you're saying is that difference of being able to think about not grabbing their attention at the wrong time, but being available for them when they need to perform a specific task. It's really about that goal orientation.
Yeah. And I can even see it for, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, the new Microsoft products, Microsoft Viva, right, is the, you know, employee experience platform is probably what they call it. See, I've watched some Microsoft, I've watched some Microsoft stuff as well. But, you know, you talked about that bulletin board as a perfect example, right? Where, you know, traditionally it's been very difficult, right? I think you alluded to this in your earlier statement, which is, you know, how do we even communicate with our frontline workers? You know, in a lot of ways, some frontline workers don't have email. They may have a mobile device and they may have applications they need to do their job, but they don't have basic communication tools, collaboration tools, maybe even email in some cases. And so now, you know, the best way we can inform them of that upcoming training is on the bulletin board when they come in. And that seems certainly kind of an antiquated way to think about doing that. And naturally, when you talked about it, I'm like, well, that's kind of what I think the problem something like Viva is supposed to try to solve.
Absolutely. Right? So Viva Connections is absolutely our answer to that. We literally observed that this is how they every day when they're checking in, there is always this notice board. Everyone looks at what is there today on the notice board, what's on the roster, right? And so Viva Connections really helps to plug in into that context, into that need, which is there on a daily basis. You're just doing it in a more flexible manner because you can do it on your mobile phone. You don't have to stand there. You don't have to crowd up. You can just be moving around, doing your jobs and looking at what exactly the equivalent of that notice board would have been. So Viva Connections is actually a great way for frontline workers to get access to everything that they care about in that one place.
Yeah. So how long have you been with Microsoft?
Oh, 15 years. It's been a while now.
Okay. So one of the things we like to kind of dig in a little bit on the podcast as well is kind of how did you get to where you are, right? So kind of what drove both your kind of path to innovation, and also what I'm really interested in here, how did you kind of land in this, in kind of the spot where you are, which is focused on frontline?
So I'll talk a little bit about my passions and my background, and then I'll talk a little bit about why this was such a deliberate thing for me. So I'm a computer science engineer, basically. And I started, I worked in different parts of Microsoft and I'd done many different roles. In fact, I've done product management. I've done I've been a developer in the past. There's many roles that I have done, and I worked on a variety of experiences as well. The thing that has been part of me as I got to know myself better and what kinds of roles I enjoy best, two things stood out to me. The first was that I'm passionate about people, and that includes the people that I'm working with, the teams that I'm leading, but very importantly the customer, right? So that was a huge part of what I love doing. The second is I really love problem solving. And we talked a little bit in the beginning about empathy and empowerment. You can see how these two things actually map, because when I'm thinking empathy, get understanding what people are about, understanding what they need, what their problems are, that curiosity aspect that comes with that passion for people, that empathy piece. And how do I use that knowledge to then go solve the problems, to empower them so that they are successful in what they're trying to accomplish? That's how I really landed in this area. I've having done different jobs previous to this current role that I'm in. I was in a product leader role for Power Platform. Power Platform is again a low code, no code. It's a collection of applications. So for instance, it's Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, Power BI. This is a suite of products. But what they really do is they allow people to build their own solutions in a low code, no code way. So that was really meaningful for me. It grabbed my attention because it didn't require someone to have a computer science degree to solve their problem, right? So I kept building upon that when I found this opportunity to go help the frontline workspace. It was just a natural extension of that desire to meaningfully contribute to empowerment.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like, when we talk about it, it's probably one of those, it's certainly one of the segments of the workforce that probably hasn't been as understood as it should be when it comes to technology. So it certainly sounds like a logical progression for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so underserved. It's so critical. It just felt like a really place close to my heart where I could contribute.
And it certainly sounds like you take kind of that empowerment message outside of work as well. I mean, I noticed from your LinkedIn profile, volunteer at economic empowerment. Talk a little bit about that. And so, I mean, it's one thing to say you're passionate about something in work, but it certainly sounds like this is a theme for you in life as well.
I would completely agree with that. Empathy and empowerment, I've found these tools to be effective in all walks of life. So what you might have seen is early on, and very early when I had joined Microsoft, I got interested in this concept of micro loans, and I started volunteering, and I actually started engaging some of my Microsoft colleagues in my volunteering efforts. So micro loans again was, and the idea of empowering people who are economically disadvantaged, but in a way that they can bootstrap themselves out of their situation. So you've probably heard the story of, like, you give someone a fish, you feed them for a day, but you give someone a fishing rod, you feed them for life. So that idea has always appealed to me. And when you provide micro loans, very small loans to the woman of in a household, it was found that the woman would then start investing in, say, she buys a sewing machine. And I say woman because at that time it was focused on women. I'm sure it applies more broadly to all genders, but specifically the finding was that the woman is very likely to give back to her family by making these small investments. Someone bought a buffalo and started selling milk. The woman would then invest in her children, send them to school. Now the cycle is broken. So that is true empowerment, because now she's able to bootstrap her entire family. Her children are going to go on to do the next level of things. So that's how that interest had started. And then I apply this regularly with my children. I have two kids, grade school kids. So I found that, understanding them with empathy, being curious about what they are saying, not being dismissive. I mean, of course, everyone tries to feels that way about their children, I'm sure. And then empowering them to solve their own problems. One of the things I always say to my children is, I'm not going to be with you everywhere forever. So I need them to be empowered to judge, make their own decisions, right? So that's how it really aligns with other aspects of my life as well.
That's fantastic. And as I said, obviously you can hear that passion coming through. And I think the story about microloans and economic empowerment, it's great. And I would love to talk about it for all day as well. But I do want to kind of pull it back and kind of continue on that theme of the kind of empowerment theme. And you mentioned kind of like you've got kind of two stakeholders that you kind of think about, right? You think about the frontline workers themselves, like the people who are going to be using the technology. And then you talk about the stakeholders within the organization who are, helping to deploy that technology and deliver that technology to that frontline workforce. So let's kind of pull it back first with the frontline. If you were to ask them, right, taking the empathy standpoint, right, what would they say their biggest challenges today?
So for sure, we've had this conversation. So it's not really a hypothetical question, right? We talk to them depending on who you're talking to. You will probably hear a few different answers, but when you put them all together, they talk about, hey, I want the ability, I want flexibility, I want access to information so that I can make the right decisions in the flow versus having to wait for someone.
Mm-hmm.
So I that access to information is critical. And I see that actually also as a very central part to empowerment. And then connection and collaboration. A lot of times frontline workers are talking a lot more to each other. So I will say that when the world suddenly went to working in the remote model, when the pandemic hit, it was fairly okay. We all obviously suffered the consequences of it. We missed being in our workplaces. Collaboration became difficult. But imagine how much harder it was for a frontline worker. They're not sitting at their desks, but they're typically operating within 3 to 5 feet of each other. Right now, they are used to talking to each other. They're used to saying, hey, can you come over and show me how I can, handle this task? That certainly changed for them. So that ability to connect, ability to collaborate, that is super important. Another thing that they struggle with on a regular basis, which I know you are well aware of, is training and onboarding.
Mm-hmm.
Just the way that changes are made. With information workers, there's typically a lot of planning that happens. There are these detailed rollouts that happen. Frontline workers don't have that luxury. They are in critical situations all the time. Their tasks are often very time sensitive, and they are not constantly on devices which they can learning is a harder thing for them, for us to even roll that out to them. So it is important to solve those challenges as well, provide them with the tooling and functionality so that it is a little bit easier, communicate with them so that you understand their problems, and communicate the solutions that you're building for them also, right? I often find that both sides of that equation break down. Sometimes we may end up solving a different problem which is not really critical to how they are operating, or we may solve it in a way that doesn't work for them, or we may have solved it in an awesome way. We haven't communicated to them how it works, so they can't make the most out of it. So all of these are problems, and there are variations of these problems that I've heard from them. Another area that I have seen is there are also generational differences in frontline workers. So there's the set of people who have been in the area, in this space for a while, who really know their jobs. They have the expertise, but to them technology seems daunting. They are more,
even invasive, right, to them, if they've been doing something a certain way for so long.
Absolutely. And who wouldn't feel that way, right? If change is hard for everybody, but then if we give them the set of we give them solutions, and their ask typically is, just tell me what I need to do, right? Like, I don't I just need to know exactly what is expected. They don't want to experiment with it. They don't want to try to learn it too deeply. They just need to do the job. And on the other hand, you have the much newer set of people who are coming into the space, who are a lot more comfortable with technology, comfortable with devices, and are also in some ways have expectations on how technology should serve them. There are people who will actually make decisions about, is this something that I want to do every day? Are these the set of tools that, how do I feel about them? Is my voice being heard? So a lot of that is also part of what we hear as we have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised so many interesting points. I mean, one of them is this notion of giving, of the need for frontline workers to kind of have the information that they need when they need it, right? And we found is that I think you've talked a little bit about this, is people can feel like they're on an island, right, in a lot of ways, right? And in some cases they are, which is, traditionally it may be that, hey, I do have the ability maybe to tap the shoulder or ask my supervisor to come over or a colleague to show me how to do something. But in some environments, they don't have that capability, right? If they're a food and beverage delivery driver or a field technician who are out there trying to solve a problem on their own, right? And they're like, I need the information at my fingertips. And then it's also kind of the way they want to consume that information, right? That generational piece, like you said, is, hey, in some ways, like, that maybe that younger generation is used to kind of the self-service model, right? Which is, I want to learn something. I know that I can pick up my device and I should be able to learn it right there and then. Which also I think goes into the other point which you're making is, hey, you've got to deliver it in the means that works for me, that I can actually use. So I go back, I was, chuckling a little bit, is, I tend to feel like, frontline workers have often been overlooked or underlooked, at least from a learning and development standpoint, right? Using the same tools that they would for desk-bound workers, even if it's like, okay, here's a 20-minute video on how to do something like this, right?
Yeah,
The
I don't have
frontline
20
worker,
minutes.
I don't have 20 minutes and I don't have the bandwidth to actually stream this video right down to my device. And so
right.
There are things that are seem fairly obvious when you break it down, right? Or when you talk to folks or observe them, but are actually like, okay, this is a challenge that now we have to meet. So I think this probably relates now to the second part of my question, which is, okay, for the people who are charged with, implementing the technology, right? Your other stakeholders, talk about their challenges.
So there's a whole range. Again, I firmly believe that they want to support their frontline workforce, right? There is growing recognition, as you said, that the word frontline has even become a lot more mainstream, because there is this growing understanding that they need it. They need to activate this workforce to simply to keep things going. There's this whole other conversation around, like, retention for many organizations has become a problem in the wake of the pandemic. So just the set of challenges has grown. So they are now the organization is now very focused on solving this. Our role there is, we want to enable them to solve these problems, for instance, by making it easy for them to go set these things up, by giving them the tools by which they can understand the feedback from their frontline. Are they really being able to plug the gap? Are they really solving the problems in a way that those needs are met? Are they looking at the tools in a way where those training and onboarding needs are also taken into account? So that, are they thinking holistically? So that's one whole piece of that conversation of, like, are we thinking about the various personas in the organization? There's often many different people, right? There's IT admins who have to roll things out. We're making it easier for them. There's also what we call the business decision makers. This might be your frontline manager.
Yep.
So we talked a lot about frontline workers, but another big set of this whole equation is frontline managers. Think about this as your store manager, right? They are often responsible for the running of the store. Now, what do they need? in order to keep things going? We have to think about that. Are they being able to provide the right information to their frontline workers, set the right expectation? Because typically they are the person who are publishing the tasks to the frontline worker, right? Your daily tasks are not coming from corporate or headquarters. Maybe headquarters will roll out standard guidelines for like COVID safety rules. But the fact that the front of the store display has to be set up, that is going to be done by the frontline manager. So it's my job, my team's job, to be thinking about that person as well and making it easy for them to perform their job. And then, of course, we talked a lot in depth about frontline workers, understanding their day-to-day flows and ensuring that our technology allows them to accomplish them in a more optimal fashion. That's important.
I'm so glad you brought up kind of this notion of the frontline manager or frontline supervisor, because it's something that we hear all the time. And in fact, one of our customers at Skillful was talking to us recently, and you mentioned the pandemic earlier, and certainly the challenges that has raised, one of which has been, this constraint on labor, right? And the challenges of hiring and bringing people on to do work. And what we've heard is that in many cases, the frontline supervisors have been asked to do the roles, right, which they can't fill, right? So whether it's a delivery driver or a technician, right, they're saying, oh, you've got to pick up these work orders, right? You've got to pick up these deliveries because we've got a gap in the workforce. So not only is frontline supervisors, doing their tasks, managing their teams, but also doing the jobs of the people that they're supervising as well. So it becomes even more critical to support them. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned that, because I think it's another kind of overlooked persona. When we talk about, I think one of the things you were alluding to is we're talking about whether it's an IT admin or the business operations leaders, IT business partners, it could be people in training. When we talk about digital transformation initiatives, right, that involves change, and you've kind of alluded to the change management issues. I'd love to kind of dig in a little bit more on that, which is, the first question is, what have you seen has been effective, and maybe what are the things that companies have done that you've seen that have kind of led to failure or disaster when trying to kind of implement, new technology solutions down to the front line?
So in terms of what has been effective, I think the biggest piece is really understanding what the problem is. That curiosity and communication, those are the two things that really work, because you need to have deep understanding of that. I don't know if you've heard the story about Henry Ford. Henry Ford used to say that, hey, if I asked people what they wanted, they would say faster horses.
Yeah.
But my job is to make sure that I understand the problem, not the solution. I don't go and ask them, what should I build? I ask them, what is it that you need solved? And I also observe, because sometimes what they say is different from actually how they're performing the tasks as well, right? So in my opinion, what works is when you truly understand that and you plug in a solution which disappears into their context. That's success. That requires also a lot of communication. So you asked me, what have you seen fail? What I've seen has failed is when there isn't what we call product fit. So when a solution is short-sighted or doesn't actually address the problem or has not taken into account other constraints that they might have. For instance, you might provide, so think about someone who's in manufacturing, right? They are wearing gloves. You give them a solution which requires them to type something, or they're not going to take off their glove every time and do that. So you need to really be thinking about all these other things that are happening, so that you can make sure that you are serving a solution that will actually work. And then you're I've seen change management done in a way where here's a new thing, there you go, right? That people are then left to their imagination on okay, why did they roll out this change? How am I supposed to use this? It's interesting when people ask questions like, well, I tried to make sense of it this way, or I tried to understand it this way. And in my head, I'm going, it would help if they had more context and became part of that change that was happening versus the change being foisted on them.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And you mentioned a couple things. One is this notion of, you've talked about, I think several times, about site visits, going on site, observing, talking to customers. And unfortunately, I think it's true that most, when people are thinking about technology, when designing technology, they're not doing that first. Is that what you kind of find?
Yeah, very often there's always these different perspectives, right? Either everyone, I think, has the right intent, but you might be looking at only a part of the problem, or you might not be aware of really deeply why that problem is occurring. So not having that context is going to result in the wrong thing being created.
Yeah, and I also think it's this notion of, giving them the technology and here you go, right? Building and designing the technology is only kind of one part. And I loved how you kind of talked about the communication aspect and even the training and adoption. I mean, certainly that's one of the things that we found, one of the reasons we started Skillful, right, is that there's this expectation is, oh yeah, once if we design it optimally and all this stuff, once we put it in users' hands, it kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah, you have to be aware of it. I mean, you can make it easier so that the adoption and learning curve is not as steep, but you need to be thinking about that aspect as well. And like we talked early on in this conversation, even thinking how that information is consumed differently between someone who's sitting at their desk and has time to go through a training versus someone who just has to see the most important thing that is relevant to them at that moment. There's a different way of doing it for both of them. You want ease for both of those personas, but in one case, there's a huge element of time criticality and time sensitivity.
Yeah, and you mentioned something earlier when we were talking about the supervisors and the managers, that stress that they're under right now, and it's stress for everyone on the front line, I think. And often, when we're rolling out new technology or anything new, but in this case, if we're thinking about technology, you roll it out, well, that just adds to their kind of stress burden. And one of the things that what we've heard is that really there's an anxiety there, right? Which is, hey, you're asking me to learn this new thing, right? Or to use this new technology. And now that may create anxiety because, geez, I've got 10 other things on my plate that I'm already doing and juggling. And now I've got to learn this new thing. Number two is, hey, I'm going to be embarrassed because I'm not going to be able to understand this, right? And maybe it's the generational thing, as you talked about, which is I'm not going to be able to pick this up very easily. I don't know. Or we've even seen it where if I don't learn this, and I don't know how to use this technology, I could lose my job. Right. So I think there's real anxiety that most people don't associate with technology. Certainly most knowledge workers, information workers may not associate technology. That's very real out on the front line.
So true. And the thing to understand about technology is it is so amazing for its potential. We can solve so many problems with it, but at the same time, if it's not done right, it can do the opposite and create all these frustrating situations, all these anxiety inducing situations. So I loved how you talked about the anxiety aspect of it. Why does technology seem daunting? Because it can feel like a task in itself. Learning it can feel like a thing in itself.
So let's get back. I just want to come back to the communication, the learning, what are the kind of best practices you've seen among your customers in terms of getting that right, that part of it right?
So part of it is you've talked a lot about change management.
Yep.
The way that we try to address it through technology on our side is building products that are inherently that make sense, that inherently that progressive disclosure is useful for them to get acquainted. We try to avoid cognitive overload in a given context. Like, are they seeing too many things? What can we do to provide them with a very catered custom experience specific to what their role is? For instance, when I've seen it done well, there is this conversation around it. There is a real understanding of the context and the timing in which it is going to be used. There is clear communication on the goals for what is this, how is this going to be accomplished, how would you do blah, how would you accomplish your goal X. That is the type of thing that I have seen as one of the best practices on just that transparency, just that regular touch base, regular communication, looking at it holistically. That is what I have seen work really well. And I've seen a number of customers do this really well. They start with a trial. They start with like, we work regularly with customers who are doing pilots, who are like, let's iron this out. Let's do it with a small group of people and see how they take to it. What are our unique challenges that we might run into? Gather the feedback, having that ability to hear the other voice as well, and then take it further to see, okay, now I'm ready to scale this up. Now I'm ready to deploy this more broadly by applying the learnings that I learned from my small group. That works really well.
And even getting that small group buy-in helps, you create, hopefully create champions within your organization among the frontline itself.
Absolutely. When the gains are tangible, they are they are being more productive, they are being able to make better decisions, they are not blocked. That just speaks for itself. And you are able to see that, there are multiple organizations that we have worked with where we have seen that transformation happen. And this entire workforce is now being able to do something in a different way, but without feeling like it was disruptive.
Yep.
That's amazing to see.
So Tulsi, I think this is a great segue because you talked to, that's amazing to see. And you're obviously very passionate about what you do. I always love to kind of ask a question of someone who's worked in technology as long as you have, as long as I have, and other people I know. What is it that you love about working in technology, and what do you hate about it? Or maybe hate's too strong a word, but what are the things that you don't like about it?
I think it's what I alluded to before. To me, technology has so much problem solving potential. Like, we can turn to it to the potential is endless. We can do so many things with it that were previously not possible, right? We can adjust our speed on how quickly we deliver it, and so on. So that's the thing, that problem solving aspect is the thing that I love about technology. What frustrates me is when we have not really thought about the practicalities of like ground realities, and when technology doesn't fit into it. I, by nature, am a little bit impatient with technology. It's a joke in our household. My husband is a lot more patient with trying out something if it doesn't work well, and I'm like, it just has to work. It's there for me. I'm not there for it. Right. So that's how I am when I'm consuming technology. I would say that, both sides of it in that sense.
Yeah, I think we've probably gotten to the point where, like you said, I think we expect a lot of technology, and sometimes there's a lot of hype around technology. And when it doesn't live up to the promise, right, it can be more frustrating than anything else. And I feel that way as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So Tulsi, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. And I love the fact that I think anybody any of our listeners out there will come away with a central theme, which really is that empathy and empowerment. And I think it's a great one to take away for anyone, really in dealing with, implementing technology or implementing anything, but especially to the front line, because as we've said, it has definitely been overlooked, underserved. And I think it's very clear that you and your organization have done a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to the front line. So again, I really want to thank you for your time and your insights today.
Absolutely, Gene. It was a pleasure to be here, and it was a great conversation for us to have.
And if folks that are listening want to reach out to you, they can find you on LinkedIn, correct?
Yes, so LinkedIn would be a great place to find me. And I can also share with you a URL for anyone who's curious about the work that my team is doing. So that would be https aka.ms/frontline workforce.
That's
So
great. And what we'll do also when we, if you check out the social channels for Frontline Innovators on LinkedIn or on Twitter, we'll put that URL in there so folks can go in there and click straight through. I think that'd be great.
awesome.
That's great. Tulsi, thank you again. And thanks to our audience for tuning in today. And to the folks listening, I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. And a friendly reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. And you can visit the Skillful website at skyllful.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. See you on our next episode.